All right, everyone, welcome back for our final topic in the Anatomy and Physiology 1 lab. The last topic that we're going to be covering is the spinal cord, peripheral nerves, and reflexes. We just discussed the brain and all of the anatomical parts that are associated with it. But the spinal cord is going to be projecting out from the brain and also projecting its own peripheral nerves off the sides. The spinal cord will project through the foramen magnum and it will travel through the vertebral canal. The spinal cord has its own anatomy that we're going to discuss in detail in this presentation, and we're also going to break down the spinal nerves that come off the sides. The spinal cord serves two major functions for our body. The first function is simply a pathway to and from the brain. The spinal cord is a direct route for the nerves that are found in our arms and our legs to bring sensory information up to the brain, and it also serves as a route for motor stimuli from our brain to travel out and affect our skeletal muscles in the arms and legs. We'll also see the spinal cord serving as our body's major reflex center, and we're going to discuss this topic separately. But as this is the lab class, of course by now you understand that we're going to be focusing mostly on the anatomy of the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is going to begin after the medulla oblongata of the brainstem is going to project it. It's going to travel through the foramen magnum and into the vertebral canal and travel all the way down to the level of our L1 or L2 vertebrae. At the top of our lumbar vertebrae, the spinal cord is going to terminate, and at this point we're going to project other spinal nerves off, and we're also going to see the continuation of the meninges down through the remainder of the vertebral canal. Just as we saw the meninges wrapping around the brain, we will have the same three layers of the meninges wrapping around the spinal cord. There is a little bit of a difference in the arrangement of the meninges wrapping around the spinal cord, but our three general layers will still be able to be found. As well as the meninges, the vertebrae and the cerebrospinal fluid are both going to offer protection to the spinal cord in general. We have to understand that the meninges will be arranged differently wrapping around the spinal cord. The vertebrae around the spinal cord are separate bones, and so this is going to affect how the meninges will lie around the spinal cord. The vertebrae were not fused together like the bones of the skull were, so naturally the meninges will not be able to be fused to the vertebrae like they were up in the cranial cavity. We'll see the arrangement of the meninges described on this slide. We'll still have our pia mater, arachnoid mater, and dura mater wrapping around the spinal cord. But since the dura mater is not directly fused to the bone in the vertebral canal, we're going to be left with this structure known as the epidural space. Epi means upon, and dura is going to refer to the dura mater. So this will be an additional space that lies between the dura mater and the bones making up the vertebral canal. We also will remember that the spinal cord terminates at the level of L1, L2, but the meninges will actually continue further down the vertebral canal to other levels. Specifically, the dura mater and the arachnoid mater are going to go down to the level of sacral vertebrae number 2. The reason that we note the location of the spinal cord termination is because the lumbar puncture procedure, which is also known as a spinal tap, is going to be administered below the level of L2. With the lumbar puncture procedure, we're trying to collect a sample of cerebrospinal fluid, and we do not want to damage the spinal cord by going in at a level where the spinal cord is present. So we're always going to want to go to a location that is below the point that the spinal cord terminates to collect a sample of cerebrospinal fluid. So we're now going to get started on the anatomy of the spinal cord. Throughout each segment of the spinal cord, as it travels from superiorly to inferiorly, we're going to have the same arrangement of the gray matter and the white matter. Let's take a quick second to distinguish once again gray matter from white matter. Gray matter is consisting of neuronal cell bodies, and white matter is consisting of myelinated axons. In the central nervous system, where the spinal cord is, the gray matter is going to be referred to as nuclei, and the white matter are going to be referred to as tracts. In the spinal cord, we do tend to give these two structures different names, but that is our technical name for gray and white matter in the central nervous system. Specifically in the spinal cord, we're going to see a different arrangement of gray matter and white matter as we saw up in the brain. You'll recall that gray matter was found on the outside of the cerebrum, and that was known as the cerebral cortex. And then the white matter was found under the cerebral cortex, which is where the myelinated axons were traveling down to eventually make their way out here into the spinal cord. So we had gray matter on the outside, and we had white matter on the inside. Well, the arrangement here with the spinal cord is going to be a bit different. Here, we're actually going to have gray matter on the inside and a layer of white matter found on the outside. As the white matter is showing us our myelinated axons, these areas are going to be called columns, as they refer to columns of myelinated axons traveling up and down the spinal cord. The gray matter in the central portion of the spinal cord is going to be referred to as horns. We'll have a posterior horn, we'll have an anterior horn, and we'll also have a lateral horn. Our two major spots of gray matter in the spinal cord will be connected by the gray commissure, which will contain the central canal of the spinal cord. You'll hopefully remember that the central canal of the spinal cord was continuous with the ventricular system of the brain. This structure is going to be lined by ependymal cells and contain cerebrospinal fluid. We'll also have the three layers of meninges wrapping around the margin of the spinal cord as well. So to further break down the specific anatomical parts of the spinal cord, we're going to first go over the gray horns. We can see the gray matter that's found here in the center of the spinal cord, and these larger arrangements of gray matter that will poke out in different directions. One thing I have not mentioned yet so far is that the gray matter of the spinal cord sort of resembles a butterfly. And I'll go back to this picture to show you that once more. We're actually looking at this butterfly upside down, but that's generally how the gray matter of the spinal cord is described here in anatomy and physiology. So if this looks like a butterfly, the head of the butterfly will be pointing anteriorly. And so what we're seeing is that this is the posterior side, and this is the anterior side. So based on that knowledge, we can see that this projection of gray matter out of the backside of the spinal cord is going to refer to the posterior gray horn. It's posterior as this is found towards the back. But here with the spinal cord, we also give this another name as the dorsal gray horn. And you can use either posterior or dorsal with this structure. This will be one of the first times that we're really going to start using the word dorsal, as this isn't a term that we've used much so far. But here in the spinal cord, it's very common to refer to posterior structures as dorsal structures. We'll see the same thing here with anterior and the word ventral. We'll remember from our first anatomical terminology presentation that the word anterior means exactly the same thing as ventral. So up here we're going to have the anterior gray horn. It's going to be sticking out here and is indicated in red, shown in this picture right here. And we'll also have the lateral gray horn that's going to project out towards the side, and this gray horn tends to be a little bit smaller than the other two. Sometimes it's a little hard to see, so it's just going to depend on the picture that we're viewing. These are your three gray horns that can be found in the gray matter of the spinal cord. But we're also going to have white matter that's found on the outside of the spinal cord, and these are arranged in columns. We'll specifically have a dorsal white column, a lateral white column, and an anterior white column. We can use the same convention with the terms dorsal and ventral as we did with the gray horns. The posterior white column, which can be found over here, can also be referred to as the dorsal white column. And here in the front, we'll find our anterior white column, also known as the ventral white column. On either side, we'll find a right and left lateral white column as well. And I'd like you to be aware that these columns can also be called funiculi. So we can refer to this as the lateral funiculus as well as the lateral white column. So once we have our gray horns down and we have our white columns down, that's actually most of the anatomy of the spinal cord itself. We're going to see that these spinal nerves, however, are going to project off the sides of a segment of the spinal cord. We have many different spinal nerves projecting off different segments of the spinal cord specifically. So let's elaborate on the structures that can be found peripheral to the spinal cord also. So first and foremost, we're going to see that this structure over here is known as a spinal nerve. This is going to project out and innervate different parts of the body. The nerves that pass through your arms and legs and also travel out to your digestive organs are these spinal nerves. But we see a very interesting arrangement of the spinal nerves when they start to get close to the spinal cord specifically. We're going to see that we have a blue neuron, a green neuron, a yellow neuron, and a red neuron. The yellow and the red neurons are depicting motor neurons, while the blue and the green neurons are depicting sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons, and they're going to bring signals into the spinal cord. When we feel something like touch or temperature, that sensory stimuli needs to travel back to the spinal cord so that it can be taken up to the brain so that we can recognize what has just happened. Motor neurons, on the other hand, are going to take motor information out to our muscles so that we can facilitate the contraction and movement of our muscles. The interesting arrangement that we see is that as the spinal nerve gets closer to the spinal cord, our sensory neurons are actually going to separate from our motor neurons. And all sensory neurons are going to take their information in towards the back side of the spinal cord, directly into the posterior gray horn. You may also note from your lecture class that most of our sensory neurons are in fact unipolar, and we can see these unipolar neurons housed here within this structure. These sensory neurons have their dendrites out in the body, and when stimuli pass through those dendrites and activate them, signals are going to come up here into the cell body for processing and eventually get sent out through the axon of our sensory neuron that will eventually synapse in the dorsal gray horn. From here, there's many places that these neurons can synapse with, but one arrangement that we'll see that's quite common is that these neurons here will eventually synapse back with these motor neurons and tell those motor neurons what motor stimuli to produce that will be in response to the sensory information that just came in. Most motor neurons will exit the spinal cord through the anterior gray horn. This branch that came off of our spinal nerve is referred to as the dorsal root. And on the dorsal root, where we have our cell bodies, we'll have what's known as the dorsal root ganglion. Just FYI, a ganglion is a gray matter structure that can be found in the peripheral nervous system. And since this structure is not in the brain or the spinal cord, this is in fact in the peripheral nervous system. We'll also have our ventral or anterior root that projects from the front side of the spinal cord and will eventually make its way to meet with the dorsal root that will form the spinal cord. So what we can see is that all sensory neurons bring in sensory information through the dorsal root, and only the axons of motor neurons can be found in the anterior root. This means that if the ventral root was damaged in some way, but the dorsal root was remaining intact, that sensory information could still come in, but no motor information would be allowed out. Connecting our two spots of gray matter was the gray commissure that also had the central canal. This, of course, is continuous with the ventricular system. Now, what we'll also see is the ventral or anterior fissure, and we'll see the dorsal or posterior sulcus. A fissure tends to be a little larger than a sulcus does, so this will actually be a much more prominent structure than the dorsal sulcus will. And we can use these two structures to indicate which side of the spinal cord that we're looking at. An example of this is shown right here. You can see the anterior median fissure is quite a bit larger than the posterior median sulcus. And now that we've gone over these two invaginations, we can see the anatomy of the spinal cord summarized on this slide. We'll have an anterior gray horn, a lateral gray horn, and a posterior gray horn, as well as a gray commissure and a central canal that can be found in the center. We'll have a posterior white column found here towards the back side, and an anterior white column that's found here towards the front side. Don't forget our two lateral white columns that can be found on either side of the gray matter of the spinal cord. We have an anterior root and we have a posterior root, and the posterior root will always contain the dorsal root ganglion. The anterior root meets with the posterior root, and that will form the spinal nerve. All of the exact same anatomical structures can be found on this slide. I'm not going to go over this whole process again, but you can see all of these structures that we just discussed labeled on this real picture of a spinal cord. But the one thing that I do want to mention is how much larger the anterior median fissure is compared to the posterior median sulcus. This structure is going to be much, much wider, and of course, it indicates which side of the spinal cord is towards the front. The other thing that you can use to tell the difference is that the gray matter of the spinal cord is in the shape of a butterfly, and the butterfly's head would be pointing towards the anterior side. So we've just seen the anatomy of a single segment of the spinal cord. But there are many different segments of the spinal cord that stack on top of each other. As the spinal cord projects down the vertebral column, we're going to see that many different pairs of spinal nerves will project out from each side of the spinal cord. Just as we separate our vertebrae into cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal, we're going to have the same arrangement here with our spinal nerves. In particular, the first 8 pairs of spinal nerves are known as cervical spinal nerves. We've got 8 cervical spinal nerves, and we'll have 12 thoracic spinal nerves just under those. We'll have 5 lumbar spinal nerves, 5 sacral spinal nerves, and 1 coccygeal pair of spinal nerves. And that's very important that we distinguish that these are in fact pairs. So specifically, we're actually going to have 16 cervical spinal nerves, 24 thoracic spinal nerves, 10 lumbar spinal nerves, and 10 sacral spinal nerves. So it's important that we indicate whether we're talking about individual spinal nerves or if we're talking about pairs of spinal nerves. The number of pairs of thoracic, lumbar, and sacral spinal nerves will be exactly the same as the amount of vertebrae that we had of each of those types. We had 7 cervical vertebrae, so we're just going to have 1 more pair of cervical spinal nerves than we had of cervical vertebrae. Now, another growth structure that we can see on the spinal cord are what are known as expansions. We can also call these enlargements as well, and they'll be indicated as such on a future slide. We have the cervical expansion that can be found up here, and we have the lumbar expansion that can be found down here. Expansions are just referring to regions where the spinal cord has become a bit larger. And the reason that we have these found in these locations is because of the increased input and output that's coming into and leaving the spinal cord to enter the arms and legs. We'll see another depiction of the expansions very, very shortly. But as we continue to go towards the bottom of the spinal cord, we must remember that the spinal cord will terminate at the level of L2. Now the spinal cord's going to come to a point, and we have a name for that point known as the conus medullaris. As the spinal cord is going to be wrapped up in the 3 meninges, the dura mater and arachnoid mater are going to continue down to the level of S2. But the pia mater is the layer that's actually going to be contacting the spinal cord specifically. So the pia mater is actually going to come together and continue down as well, going all the way to the coccyx. This is going to form a tiny little ligament that we can see, known as the filum terminale. This structure will actually appear white, and we'll see it here in just a few slides. There's one other structure that can be found here with the pia mater that's connecting the spinal cord to the vertebrae. We have denticulate ligaments that can be found down the spinal cord that are simply just extensions of the pia mater going out to the vertebrae. We unfortunately will not be able to see those on any of the models. But what we can see is the conus medullaris and the filum terminale internum. I actually learned this structure as the filum terminale internum, so if I do use that terminology, just know that I'm talking about this structure. But you'll see the conus medullaris here, where the spinal cord comes to a point, and we're going to have that filum terminale that travels all the way down to the coccyx. One other structure that we can see labeled on this slide is known as the cauda equina. The cauda equina refers to the bundle of spinal nerve fibers that come off of the terminating spinal cord. This bundle is also going to continue down the vertebral column and project out the remainder of the spinal nerves. We can nicely see the cauda equina shown here, and we'll also in fact be able to see the conus medullaris coming to a point, and this white filum terminale internum that's coursing down the center of the vertebral canal all the way down to the coccyx. One other gross arrangement that we will see with our spinal nerves are what are referred to as nerve plexi. We have 4 nerve plexi that will be formed by the fusion of spinal nerves. We have the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, and the sacral plexus. To be specific, a nerve plexus is a network of nerves that ensures that innervation gets to particular areas. Oftentimes we will refer to the lumbar and sacral plexi as one unit. That would be called the lumbosacral plexus. And we see the large sciatic nerve coming off of the sacral plexus down here. This is going to be one of the largest nerves in the body, and it's going to travel down the leg. The nerve plexi are showed once again on this slide, but also I've included the spinal nerves that give rise to each nerve plexus. The cervical plexus is specifically going to be formed by all of the spinal nerves between C1 and C5. So 5 cervical spinal nerves are going to give rise to this plexus that's going to innervate the muscles of the neck and the upper shoulder. The brachial plexus, which is one of the more commonly learned nerve plexi that we have, is going to be formed by the roots of the spinal nerves C5 through T1. The brachial plexus is going to project 5 major nerves all of which will travel into the arm. We'll see as both of these nerve plexi are projecting from C1 all the way down to T1, the cervical enlargement is going to be found right here, as more input and output is coming into and leaving the spinal cord at this location. Coursing down, we'll see the lumbar enlargement, and just below the lumbar enlargement, we're going to see our other two nerve plexi. The lumbar plexus is formed by the roots of spinal nerves L1 through L4, and the sacral plexus is formed by the roots of spinal nerves L4 to S4. The sacral plexus will always project that sciatic nerve, which we can see is very large and coursing down the leg. Now up here we can also see the conus medullaris at the location where the spinal cord comes to an end. This is going to be the level of L2. We've also got the cauda equina, which is this bundle of nerve fibers that are going to project from the terminating spinal cord. And then we'll have the filum terminale internum, which courses all the way down the center, down to the coccyx. This is an extension of the pia mater that continued after the spinal cord terminated. Now the last structure on this slide that I'm going to point out are the sympathetic chain ganglia. Ganglia, as I already mentioned, are collections of gray matter that can be found in the peripheral nervous system. And our sympathetic nervous system in particular will have its own ganglia that form this chain of gray matter. These will generally be found on the inside of the thoracic cavity. And when activated, these sympathetic chain ganglia, working for the sympathetic nervous system, will generally increase body activity. The last concept that we're going to discuss in relation to the spinal cord is the specific arrangement of our spinal nerves. A clear definition of peripheral nerves are any type of nerve that project out from the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes all of these peripheral nerves, and the cranial nerves also fall under the explanation of our peripheral nervous system. Spinal nerves have a very specific arrangement, and I think that you will come to find that this arrangement is very similar to the arrangement of our skeletal muscles. So first and foremost, the main structure in a nerve is going to be a myelinated axon. We'll have the axon shown here with the myelin sheath that's wrapping around it. Now nerves are arranged in bundles. There's many different axons that can be found in one nerve. And we're going to partition each of these myelinated axons with their own connective tissue. This structure is known as the endoneurium. This layer of connective tissue wraps around one individual myelinated axon. And in fact, every single myelinated axon will get its own layer of endoneurium. Now from here, we're going to take a bunch of these endoneurium-wrapped myelinated axons, and we're going to wrap them in another layer of connective tissue known as the perineurium. And this is what depicts a fascicle. So I'm sure that you can see where we're going with this by now. After we take a bunch of fascicles and bundle them up together, we're going to be left with our last connective tissue layer known as the epineurium. So from superficial to deep, we have this layer of connective tissue, the epineurium, that wraps around all of our nerve fascicles. A fascicle is a bundle of myelinated axons, and it can be demarcated by being wrapped in the perineurium. Making up our fascicles are individual myelinated axons that all are wrapped up in their own layer of endoneurium. And we can see a real section of a nerve shown on this slide. You've got the epineurium that's found wrapping around the entire nerve fiber, and you've got these individual nerve fascicles, which will be wrapped up in their own perineurium. The endoneurium will be a little challenging to see on this slide, so I'm going to come and show you the endoneurium on this close-up of a nerve fascicle. Once again, you can see the perineurium right here, and all of these different myelinated axons that are bundled up together inside of this nerve. You can see that every single one of these little circles in here is depicting a myelinated axon. The center portion is the axon itself, and the outer clear region is indicating the myelin sheath that's made up by the Schwann cells. So between these two individual myelinated axons, we will find our layer of endoneurium. With the peripheral nervous system specifically, and peripheral spinal nerves, we call these neurons teased medullated nerves. This is just a fancy way to say myelinated nerves. And we're seeing a longitudinal section showing us the axon wrapped up in its myelin sheath. At this location right here, we find a node of Ranvier, which is going to be one of those bare areas between the two myelin sheaths. You can also see a node of Ranvier shown up here as well. So I hope that you're feeling very comfortable with the concepts presented around the nervous system. Our final topic that will be discussed with the spinal cord and the spinal nerves will be reflexes.